presentation at the meeting of the Humanists, Free Thinkers of Fairfield County, known by its initials HFFC of Connecticut. And this meeting, held on April 13th, 2020, features as our guest presenter Bruce Becker, who, among other things, is president of the Electric Vehicle Club of Connecticut. The title of his presentation, as we've titled it, is The Future of Electric Vehicles, which has many, many different implications. So Bruce, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Carrie, and thank you, Paul, for inviting me to speak with your group. I have to say that I wasn't aware of your mission, but it's something I identify with a great deal. And I think it's also particularly timely with the pandemic to reflect on what we can do as sort of sharing responsibility, using science and reason to chart a course forward that looks out for our collective interests. There are a lot of parallels between the climate crisis and the COVID-19 crisis. The COVID-19 crisis has turned the world upside down, but the climate change crisis has even more destructive and far-reaching power to affect us. And but I think there are lessons from the current time that we're in that we can use to make better decisions. If anything, what we're facing now is an example of what happens when you don't pay attention to reason and science. And it's tragic that that as a country we are not leading on this, but it's also tragic that we're not leading on the issues of climate change in the United States. Hopefully, when people think locally and collectively, that can change. I'm going to share my screen, but before doing that, I'll give you a little more background into where I'm coming from and the Electric Car Club. But I encourage people to raise their hands and speak up if a question comes up as a result of my comments. I'm an architect. I grew up in Fairfield County. I grew up in New Canaan. My father was a planner. My mother was a furniture designer. I went to the public schools in New Canaan. And then I went to school at Amherst College and studied American Studies and Humanities and Fine Arts. And then after working in Boston for a year or so, I went to Yale and studied architecture and business. So I have a master's in both architecture and an MBA from Yale. And I purposely educated myself so that I could have a broader role in making buildings. I was always interested in architecture and buildings, but I wanted, because my father was a planner and often was involved in doing the programming for building assignments, I got interested in being involved in charting the purpose of buildings, not just what they look like, but other aspects of the purposes of buildings and how they're perceived and created. And so that led me to a career of making buildings, both as architect, but also as developer. And in the course of doing that, I've tried to broaden my understanding of how buildings work and impact the environment and energy. And that in turn brought me to focus on the importance of electric vehicles. Because those of us who are architects and are committed to building green buildings realize that, at least in the Northeast, it's actually the transportation sector that has the biggest impact on the environment, both in terms of particulate pollution and also in terms of global warming. So it's hard to have a career committed to the creation of green buildings without giving equal emphasis to helping our country and our community migrate to electric transportation. I did fine-tune the title of my talk. it's flattening the carbon curve, the future of electric cars and the built environment. One thing that I think is has been a collective learning experience for humanity is this notion of flattening the curve. When you have a threat such as the corona virus, um, people have, I think, gotten the message that by collective action, we can lessen the impact of that. That's actually, I can't think of another sort of scientific principle that everyone has had to learn rapidly. But people finally have gotten this and done what our political leaders have been unable to do, despite lots of advocacy from environmental groups. They have changed our behavior in ways that I think are going to change us forever, in ways that hopefully are very positive. So I didn't really know what free thinkers and humanists were, I have to admit, but I did a little reading about your organization, and I realized that I was, in fact, aligned with you in that I believe, as you do, that you should form opinions on the basis of reason, independently of authority. I mean, my nature is if authority is telling me something to question it. That's been a rule of mine from the very beginning, because often authority and conventional wisdom is wrong, I've discovered. And as humanists, you all seek to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good. And those values are the essence of what's inspired me to try to flatten the carbon curve in my personal and professional work. In the same way that we embrace social distancing in the interest of the greater good, we also need to do fossil fuel distancing to make our buildings and drive vehicles which don't harm the planet and damage the health of others. This is a relatively new idea, but increasingly people are understanding this and are taking it seriously, which is very necessary. This is the curve that we've all been confronting with the COVID-19. The United States has the unfortunate distinction of now having over 20,000 deaths from this virus and a rate of increase that is not abating. But this is very similar to what the curves that you see with the carbon, the global warming and the atmosphere having an unsustainable amount of carbon. So there are direct parallels. This virus is just happening a little bit faster, and relative to that, the carbon problem is happening in slow motion, but it's not as slow as it used to be. One thing that I think is going to be learned from this pandemic is how quickly we can, apologize for that, how quickly we can reverse direction in terms of the amount of carbon that we are putting into the atmosphere. And this is a before and after photograph of Delhi. And you can see what it was like just weeks ago and what it's like today. We have forgotten how nice it is to have clean air and to be able to see distant views. This is a before and after NASA satellite showing the average concentration of nitrous dioxide from March of last year and March of today. And there's a 30% reduction. This is a striking reduction, which will make us all healthier. I've actually installed a device from a company called Purple Air that allows you to monitor the air. It costs less than $100. You can put it on your house and connect to your Wi-Fi. And for several years now, I've been monitoring the air quality in Westport, where I live, down by Campo Beach. And this is a screenshot that I sent to the first selectman the summer before last, when I was eager to see this, my own town, take greater action to reduce fossil fuel use. And generally, anything above 35 is considered to be unhealthy. And we were at 106, and we're very often, we have a failing grade in the whole state of Connecticut in terms of our the ozone in the air quality here. And very often we are in an unhealthy place with our air quality in the Northeast. We have the American Lung Association estimates that there's over 100 deaths a year in Connecticut from pollution. When you buy a gallon of gasoline and burn it in your car, there is an unfunded health impact of $1.16 a gallon. So when you go to fill up your car, you think that maybe the gas prices are low, but you're not counting the impact that burning that gasoline has on your neighbors and on your community and the health impacts there. So this is a problem, but fortunately we've seen how quickly it can be reversed. This past weekend, I took a screenshot of this same data, and I was at a 3 at my house, which is extraordinarily clear air, something that we haven't seen. I've actually never seen this get that low before. So with collective action, we can make radical changes that have great benefits. And that's one lesson that I hope comes from this experience that is challenging us. What's interesting is that with all of the concern and correct concern about saving lives to reduce the impact from the virus, there actually are more deaths every year in our country from elevated pollution than we're currently experiencing with this virus. And yet there has been an absence of collective action just because it's happening so slowly. In Connecticut, just going back a couple of decades, we now have a 25% emission increase overall, 10% per person. So this is something we have to reverse if we want to have a healthy climate and a healthy home. This was a recent article in the Wall Street Journal. The title is "Coronavirus Got Rid of Smog. Can Electric Cars Do So Permanently?" The answer is yes. And these are annual deaths from air pollution that have been, scientists have agreed are things that we are facing. And so it's on a scale exceeding the coronavirus. And yet our political leaders have not taken action. So part of this has to come with our community and our outreach to our elected officials. Interestingly, there's also new studies that show that the coronavirus has increased death rates in areas that have high pollution. So it's being compounded. But this is not just a public health issue. This is also an economic issue. The cost to our economy of this pollution is $37 billion annually. So there are often arguments made by the fossil fuel industry that we can't afford stricter emission standards, but that's baloney. The emissions themselves are a huge tax, and particularly in Connecticut, where you have, we're not a producer of fossil fuels. Every dollar we spend on fossil fuels is basically a drain on the economy. So the move to electric vehicles, where we can make the electricity from solar panels or fuel cells or offshore wind, this is a way to actually strengthen our local economy, not hurt it.